US President Donald Trump says the US has total control over the Strait of Hormuz, a claim Iran has disputed as traffic on the strategic waterway sinks to a 3-month low.
Japan slammed Russia over what it deemed a provocative move after President Vladimir Putin made his first visit to the disputed Kuril Islands on Thursday.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to seize ships belonging to European countries in retaliation for plans to intercept and seize sanctioned Russian vessels. Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to seize ships belonging to European countries in retaliation for plans to intercept and seize sanctioned Russian vessels. A total solar eclipse plunged parts of Europe into darkness, from the remote Arctic region of northern Russia to parts of Greenland, Iceland, and Spain.
US President Donald Trump has said Washington is in control of the strategic Strait of Hormuz and will keep it even as transit through the arterial waterway fell to a 1-week low. Writing on his social media platform on Wednesday, Trump hailed the U.S. naval blockade, describing it as, quote, wall of steel. His claim follows an earlier one made on Tuesday as diplomatic efforts to end the conflict and fully reopen the strait have continued to stall. However, Iran has again rejected Trump's latest claims. According to a post on X by Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority, the Strait of Hormuz, quote, remains blocked and will not be opened until Iran's conditions are accepted. Amid their contradictory claims, data from a trade intelligence firm revealed that maritime traffic via the Strait of Hormuz was close to a 3-month low. Only 13 ships passed across the strait on Tuesday, around 90% fewer than the daily average of 130 prior to the US and Israel attacking Iran on February 28, after which Tehran effectively closed the strait.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin visited the far eastern Kuril Islands for the first time on Thursday, prompting strong protests from Japan, which also claims the territory. Japan's top diplomat Toshimitsu Motegi slammed the visit, stressing that the islands, which Tokyo calls the Northern Territories, are inherently theirs, both historically and under international law. Russian state media posted videos of Putin on Iturup, the largest of the disputed islands, visiting a school, a hospital, and a fish processing complex where he sampled caviar. The Russian leader's stop came after a brief visit to Sakhalin, a nearby Russian island where the Navy was conducting drills. In Sakhalin, Putin held a meeting on, quote, ensuring the security of Russia's eastern borders. The Kuril archipelago was seized by Russia in August 1945, just days after the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in the dying stretch of World War II. The mineral-rich islands have grown in strategic importance to the Kremlin, providing them with military bases and fishing grounds. The islands were previously home to some 17,000 Japanese, whom Russia deported shortly after annexation, and are today home to around 20,000 Russian citizens. Relations between Moscow and Tokyo have remained sour since, especially after Russia sought closer ties with China and North Korea, whom Tokyo has had turbulent relations with. The last visit by a Kremlin head of state to the islands was back in 2010 by then-President Dmitry Medvedev, who later revisited several times as prime minister.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to seize ships belonging to European countries in retaliation for plans to intercept and seize Russian vessels suspected of being part of Moscow's so-called shadow fleet. New sanctions passed last month now permit EU members to sell the oil or any other cargo seized from these vessels. Putin slammed the move, calling it piracy.
Мы видим, что власти некоторых стран в нарушении международного морского права пытаются ограничить движение судов наших эконом-операторов. Мирно, подчеркну. А недавно додумались до возможности захвата наших судов и продажи награбленного у нас имущества. Разумеется, это не что иное, как пиратство и разбой. И если это на практике начнет реализовываться, мы вынуждены будем отвечать зеркально.
Several European countries have intercepted ships that were carrying Russian oil or other cargo. These vessels are often old and in poor condition and are used to circumvent Western sanctions on Russia. One of such vessels seized was a Russian ship suspected of transporting grain from occupied Ukraine. Swedish court documents showed Stockholm will transfer the ship to Kyiv.
Colombian rescuers are racing against time to find more survivors after the devastating 7.4 magnitude earthquake that killed at least 216 people. A 32-year-old woman was recently pulled alive from a collapsed building, sparking cheers as exhausted crews continue searching for survivors. Across western Colombia, soldiers, firefighters, and volunteers used cranes, sniffer dogs, and heavy machinery to search collapsed buildings. In Cali, residents also dug through rubble with picks, shovels, and their bare hands. Beyond the rescue effort, many families spent the night outdoors as aftershocks rattled damaged neighborhoods. A park in Pereira became a makeshift shelter for people who had lost their homes. The earthquake also damaged a hospital in Cali, forcing doctors to treat some patients outside. President Abelardo de la Espriella declared a state of emergency and promised rent subsidies. Following the migration crisis where tens of thousands of people forced their way into the Spanish enclave of Ceuta on 30 and 31st of July, Morocco's National Human Rights Council has presented a report accusing the Spanish police of assaulting those migrants with allegations of mistreatment that, according to the text, occurred out of camera view. This is not the first time this council has pinned the responsibility on the Spanish authorities for keeping gates closed, as it targeted Spain in 2022 after the Melilla border fence was stormed, which resulted in the death of 23 people. The latest accusation comes just one day after Ceuta received Foreign Minister José Manuel Álvarez, who traveled on Tuesday and emphasized cooperation with Morocco to return migrants who entered illegally.
La integridad del espacio Schengen está totalmente garantizada en Ceuta y en Melilla. Y también, igualmente, aprovecho para plantear en Europa la necesidad de reforzar el apoyo a Ceuta, también a Melilla, y de que se tenga en cuenta su especificidad también desde un punto de vista social y económica.
But these positive words toward Morocco came while the neighboring country claims sovereignty over Ceuta and Melilla, two autonomous cities that have never belonged to Morocco, despite being in Africa. The Spanish minister, who has avoided confrontation with his southern neighbor, promised that every single person who crossed irregularly would be returned to Morocco, a message also directed at the other 26 EU member states that have criticized Spain's migration policies.
On Wednesday, a total solar eclipse plunged parts of Europe into darkness. The rare event drew crowds outdoors, with specialist eclipse glasses selling out, and many people even traveling to Spain, Portugal, or Iceland to witness it. The moon first blotted out the sun in the remote Arctic region of northern Russia. It then passed down through parts of Greenland and Iceland. The eclipse plunged western Iceland into complete darkness, although heavy cloud cover and rain blocked visibility of the sun disappearing behind the moon. Meanwhile, excitement built in Spain, where day also briefly turned into night. The country witnessed its first total solar eclipse in more than a century. But as always, the phenomenon was only short-lived. In parts of Russia and Greenland, the total eclipse lasted under 2.5 minutes. For observers in Spain, it lasted less than 2 minutes just before sunset. The partial eclipse process, however, lasted much longer, roughly 1 hour and 45 minutes, as the moon crossed the sun's path.
Standing 8 hours per day in an archaeological site with no shade, or leading a city tour by 30 degrees in the midst of the touristic season, and while Europe is facing record-breaking temperatures, several tourist guides wander on the front line during heat waves, and they face the consequences. Last summer, a 56-year-old guide died after collapsing while leading a visit of the Colosseum in Rome in scorching heat.
Cet après-midi, je vous en parle même pas. On a été à Pérouge, qui est une petite ville médiévale là, qui est nord-est de Lyon et il fait plus de 40 degrés au soleil, enfin, c'est assez compliqué.
The French guide says while self-employed tourist guides may ask their customers to cancel or postpone the visit because of the heat, it is often not an option for guides working for intermediaries since the visits are sometimes booked well in advance.
La plupart du temps, on travaille pour une agence, un tour opérateur, un croisiériste, enfin, ça peut être très varié comme je disais avant. Et là, c'est eux qui choisissent, très clairement, et la plupart du temps, c'est pas annulé. Mais ça arrive.
Instead of cancelling a visit, some of his colleagues have, for instance, asked their employers to turn a bike tour into a bus tour or to replace a walking tour of the city by a visit of an air-conditioned museum. Gabriel says these changes are also in the interest of the visitors, as most of his customers are above 60 years old and some do not support the heat. Meanwhile, while the UK is set to face its hottest summer on record, the head of training for the European Federation of Tourist Guide Associations says sites should extend their opening hours to allow early and late visits during the coolest part of the day.
In Greece, a lot of museums and open-air sites open very early in the morning, and they remain open until 8, 9 o'clock in the evening. So people can visit at times which are more comfortable rather than in the midday sun.
Themis also encourages museums and sites to build covers for groups to wait in the shade while queuing to enter or when stopping for explanations. Other solutions include distributing water bottles, increasing the number of public water fountains, and installing misters to cool visitors down. While heat waves are said to become more intense and more frequent due to climate change, visitors could also favor a trip in May or September rather than at the height of summer.